dark. I can't see anyone. I'm going to read I write some prose poems, so I'll read some of those. And I'd also like to read excerpts from a new story that I'm working on right now. The first one is about painting a self-portrait. I like to paint as well as write, and I feel that painting your own face is one of the most difficult things about painting. Painting a stranger is much easier than painting your own face. So the first piece is called Colors of the Face. Dip the paintbrush into burnt sienna and draw the outline of your face and your features. Burnt sienna, like the color of the red soil of Kenya that intensifies whenever it rains. When you ran on it barefooted, it coated your skin and brought the color of your skin one shade closer to the other children's. And if you forgot to tread the ground lightly when walking home from the bus stop, Mother complained that the red stain on the white socks would never come out no matter how hard she scrubbed the socks in soapy water. Mix cadmium red medium with a touch of yellow light and smooth it over burnt sienna. For the skin color you could never change no matter how long you sat in the sun. You did not understand when Father said, "You will always be Korean," until the kids in the street shouted, "Bruce Lee," every time they saw you and executed bad karate moves. For the eyes, you paint ovals of burnt umber, like the tight balls of hair that stuck up from Emily Mabongo's head, like horns when you met her on her first day of school. She sat next to you and you spent the rest of primary 3 exchanging notes during class. The following year, you ran together in the cross-country race at Green Acres. Dab the lips with some red and white, a tinge of pink like the ballet slippers you traded in for music books, because Mother and Father thought knowing how to play the piano was so much better than dancing on the stage and getting ill after a week-long performance at the Nairobi Theatre. Paint threads of cadmium yellow and ultramarine blue on the brown hair, for the highlights left by the hot sun that beat on your head for 11 years. You believed that the sun was strong enough to dry all the moisture in your body until you were left as light as a stick, carried from place to place by the wind. Darken the throat with slate for the shadow cast by the chin. Slate like Table Mountain, which you climbed every week. As you stood at the top looking down on Cape Town and the ocean, your thigh burned with pain and your body echoed the pulsing of your heart. You reached out with your hands to touch the clouds rushing by, and for one moment you forgot the pain and felt only the coolness left on your skin by the clouds. You step back now. Each step softens the brushstrokes. Patches of color shift to find their place. Wet paint glistens on the canvas. The next piece is a story that I started working on recently, so it's not titled yet, but it has to do with languages. I'm sure a lot of you, either as having immigrant parents, have had to deal with being bilingual or multilingual, and so that's what this story is about. So I'll just read short excerpts from that. Abandoning her rag doll on her bed, Jinhee sat by the window, leaning close to the pane until her breasts formed a small circle of white on the glass. She could see Langata Road from where she sat. Although she and her parents had lived in Nairobi for over 6 months, Jinhee was startled to see so many trees outside and such red soil. Her eyes shifted from side to side. The Askari sat dozing outside the guard shack on a wooden crate. The shopper boy was trimming the hedge surrounding the flats. But Jinhee's eyes returned to the road. Then she heard the familiar rattling hum. The beat-up white Volkswagen Beetle was pulling up to the gate already. Startled, Askari jumped up from his crate and ran to open the gate. Jinhee watched as Margaret climbed out of the car. As always, Margaret carried her big bag full of books and toys for Jinhee's English lesson. Margaret was the most beautiful teacher Jinhee had. She had hazel eyes that looked soft, brown freckles all over her face and arms, and a small gap between her two front teeth. She always wore faded jeans and leather sandals, and her red hair was brushed until it sat like a large balloon on her head. But the most beautiful part of her was her voice. Whenever Margaret talked, Jinhee thought of hot caramel swirling in a big pot. She had heard her parents say that, compared to Korean, English sounded like softened butter. The words seemed to glide off Margaret's tongue and land gently on Jinhee's ears. Although Jinhee did not understand anything Margaret said, she liked Margaret because she let her play with toys. But this Saturday, Jinhee waited eagerly for Margaret because it was their last lesson. Jinhee would start school in a few weeks. When Margaret arrived, they sat on the couch. Jinhee watched silently as Margaret opened her bag. One by one, Margaret set the toys on the table and watched Jinhee expectantly. But Jinhee could not remember the names of the toys. Then her eyes fell on the last toy in Margaret's hand. Without thinking twice, she grabbed it and shouted, "Car!" The toy was a miniature of Margaret's Volkswagen, except this one was a bright yellow. Margaret laughed softly and said, "Very good." When the lesson ended, Jinhee leaned out the window, waving to the white beetle rattling down the road. She clutched the yellow beetle in her hand. Now the next section is Jinhee's first day at school, where she meets her teacher and her classmates. Mrs. Thompson's icy blue eyes made Jinhee afraid, but Mrs. Thompson's smile took Jinhee's hand and led her to her seat. Jinhee sank into her white wooden chair. Everyone had stopped their work to stare at her. A girl sat next to her. "Hi, my name is Rachel," the girl said, and that was all Jinhee understood all day. Rachel talked, pointing at the blackboard and at Jinhee's workbook on the desk. But Jinhee could only think about how blonde Rachel's hair was, and how nice it was that she had curls to frame her face. Rachel smiled. Jinhee smiled back, but they both had big gaps where their front teeth had fallen out. Throughout the day, Rachel cooed at Jinhee and fluttered around like a mother hen. Looking around the room, Jinhee noticed everyone was busy. The girl sitting across from her had tiny braids all over her head. She mouthed each letter as she drew lines on the page, furrowing the smooth, dark skin of her forehead. Two boys sitting behind her started poking each other with their pencils, bursting into fits of laughter. Jinhee turned to the book in front of her. Everyone else in the class had one. It had a picture of a big fat pencil on the cover with words all around. Jinhee recognized the letters but did not understand what they meant. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. Mrs. Thompson began to speak. Everyone stopped writing and looked up at her, but Jinhee was frightened. She looked around the room, but she could not hear. She could not speak. She could not move her hand to clasp the pencil and open her book. Her eyes jumped from Mrs. Thompson's cold eyes to Rachel's blonde curls to the alphabet chart on the wall. Finally, her eyes fell on the window. She could see big white clouds quickly drifting by in the bright sky. How fast they were going. She wished she could ride away with them. The bell rang at the end of the day. Jinhee had not opened her mouth once the whole day. She looked around, wondering if she had to come back the next day when she saw Rachel beckoning her to follow. The two girls ran out of the cool classroom and into the afternoon sun. Throwing their bags and shoes in a heap, they ran into the flat, open field. Sharp, dry grass pricked the soft soles of Jinhee's feet. Hot soil rose, clinging to her legs. She stretched her arms wide, her face tilting to the sky, her body straining up. The girls ran in circles until the sky turned into a bright, hot tunnel. Giddy and laughing, eyes shut tight, they collapsed, the dry grass tickling behind their ears, poking through their shirts and into their backs. Jinhee opened her eyes. The world was immense. No ground held her down. Large white clouds swam so close, almost brushing against the tip of her nose. She thought she could stick out her tongue and lick the clouds as they passed. As they rolled by like a herd of elephants marching across the field, Jinhee saw small dents here and there, patches of light falling through onto her face. One large cloud hung like a thick veil, shrunk from the tips of her left hand to the tips of her right hand. She lifted her hands to embrace it. At home, Mother asked Jinhee how school was, but Jinhee saw only the white clouds beneath the blue sky. One more excerpt from the story, and then I'll read some more prose poems. This is further on in Jinhee's life, where she had to start Korean school on Saturdays. Jinhee complained of a stomachache, but Father said, "Go and get dressed. We're leaving in 5 minutes." She wanted to ask why she had to go to school on a Saturday while none of her friends had to, and why she had to learn Korean when she now knew how to speak, read, and write perfectly in English. In the car, Father said, "You're a Hanguk saram. You must not forget your language." As they pulled up to the school, Jinhee saw Korean boys and girls of all ages scattered about in groups. She did not know any of them. Sighing, she followed Father into the school. "Let's see how she does in the class, and if she catches on quickly, we will send her up to the other class," said the teacher. Jinhee peered at the class from behind her father. There was one other girl and a boy. Both of them looked younger than her. She looked up at Father, but all he said was he would pick her up when school was over. Mrs. Park, the teacher, gave Jinhee a textbook and asked the class to open the book to the first page. Jinhee sat down next to the boy and opened her book. "Jinhee, why don't you read the first page for us?" said Mrs. Park. She looked down at the page in front of her. The black lines blurred together into dots that shifted. She blinked and shook her head to stop the lines from shifting. The characters looked familiar, but Jinhee could not trust her tongue to form the right sounds. She read the characters silently. Yodam, summer. It sounded good in her head. The other girl giggled and whispered, "Hey, Pablo, you can't even read." Blushing, Jinhee glared at her, wishing she could throw her book at her. "Mina, please be quiet," said Mrs. Park. Tracing the lines of each character with her eyes, Jinhee remembered how she had watched Father make calligraphy. She helped him make mok by rubbing the ink stick back and forth in the palette filled with water. Father had covered his small hands with his big one, pushing the muck back and forth. When the water was dark enough, he dipped the brush in it until the hairs held just the right amount of ink to write one character. Next to his white rice paper, Father placed sheets of old newspaper. He gave Jinhee an old brush and showed her how to write her name in Korean. Jinhee dipped her brush in the ink and carefully copied what Father had written. She sat back, satisfied with her work of shaky lines and ink splotches. She looked at Father's white rice paper now covered with characters. His hand moved rapidly, leaving behind firm and smooth brushstrokes. Looking down at the page of characters, Jinhee thought about Father's smooth brushstrokes and Margaret's swirling caramel. She was afraid her tongue would not know which rhythm to move to, and she would end up with a page of shaky lines and ink splotches. Mrs. Park was waiting, impatiently tapping her pen on her book. Jinhee rolled her tongue to give sound to the words. The last two pieces I'd like to read are short pieces, and there are certain images of Kenya. I think that will always stay with me. The first one is called The Shade of the Mango Tree. The shade of the mango tree is cool and dark, even though small patches of sunlight fall from between the leaves. The smell of the clear syrup that oozes out from the stems of fruits is thick and sweet. The beetles in the tree buzz above me, dancing from one fruit to another. The flowers have turned to fruit, but the beetles return. Perhaps they enjoy the smell like me. Father spends hours catching the beetles with his hands and stomping on them. He says this will stop them from coming back, but but they are here every year and every day, moving from one mango to another, searching, searching. The fruit is bright yellow with a patch of orange in the middle. I press it firmly with both hands, making sure it squeezes right. The Shamba boy told me that I must eat the fruit with the skin, instead of peeling and throwing away the skin like most wazungu. The skin breaks easily as my teeth sinks into the stringy flesh. Juice squirts out of the side of my mouth and dribbles down to my chin. I slurp the juice as I pull away my bite. Stringy bits lodge between my teeth. The flesh falls apart in my mouth into small sweet flakes, while the chewy skin spreads its minty flavor over my tongue. The juice from my mango drips down my fingers, my hands, and splashes on the grass, staining yellow on green. I take another bite from my mango. The beetles buzz next to me, the gentle whirring of their wings tickling the tips of my ears. The last piece is called The Smell of Kenya. I can smell Kenya. During the hot summer months of Chicago, when the air is thick and dense as though it cannot escape into space, I catch a trace of it and turn my nose to take a big breath to fill my lungs, but it is already gone. Arriving at Jomo Kenyatta Airport, I step out of the airplane, taking that big breath that I have been waiting so long to take. The smell has not changed. It is the smell of dust rising from the ground to meet the sun, the smell of moisture hanging so heavy in the clouds it pulls them closer to the earth, the smell of maize, its hard pearly kernels breaking under the pressure of a fingernail and letting out creamy juice and pulp. The smell of dry wood burning in the jikos, where street vendors roast maize to sell to children coming home from school. The smell of cows and goats grazing in the field, protected by young boys waving wooden stalks above their heads. The smell of dung huts, whose walls soften when the rain falls. The smell of my sweat as the sun scorches my scalp. Leaving Kenya behind once more, I step onto the plane taking me back to America. I hear the thud of the door, shutting out the familiar air. The flight attendants walk down the aisle, spraying the cabin with chemicals in a bottle. I ask them what they are doing. This is to sterilize the air.